The sun was already sinking behind the jagged line of the mesas, painting the sky with streaks of burnt orange and violet. A dry wind rolled through the valley, stirring dust over the abandoned corrals and rattling the tin signs nailed to weather-beaten posts. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, lonely, hungry, and hollow. It was the kind of sound that made a man stop and listen, wondering if he'd made a mistake coming this far out where the land gave nothing easy. The rancher sat tall in the saddle, his coat frayed at the edges and his hat shadowing eyes hardened by years of drought and disappointment. The desert had taken much from him, friends, cattle, hope, and yet he rode on, as if something deeper than survival pulled him forward. His name wasn't spoken much around town anymore. Folks knew him as the man who worked alone, the one who'd lost his claim to the bank and never spoke about the night his barn burned down. He didn't speak of the woman who'd once lived there either. Now, all that remained was his horse, his Winchester, and a promise he meant to keep. He reached the edge of an old village, half ghost, half alive. A few flickering oil lamps glowed through crooked windows. The smell of mesquite smoke and stew drifted faintly from the saloon's chimney. It was a settlement that time had nearly forgotten, tucked between red canyons in scrubland. The sign by the road read Silver Bend, but most just called it the last stop before nothing. The rancher tied his horse outside the livery stable and walked down the dirt street. Every step crunched like dry bones beneath his boots. He passed the general store, its porch sagging under the weight of a rocking chair that swayed without a breeze. From inside the saloon, a slow tune hummed from an old piano, low, haunting, and slightly off-key. Inside, the room was thick with tobacco smoke and murmured voices. A few men leaned over their drinks, eyes tired, faces drawn. Behind the bar stood a man polishing a glass, nodding once as the rancher entered. The sound of spurs on the wooden floor drew quiet attention from the corner tables. "Didn't expect to see you back, stranger," the barkeep muttered. "Heard you'd given up this side of the range." The rancher didn't answer. He slid a coin across the counter and pointed to a bottle. The barkeep hesitated, then poured him a drink. As the amber liquid caught the lamplight, the saloon doors creaked again. She walked in slow, too calm for the tension that followed her. Her dress was plain but clean, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, and her dark hair fell in waves that caught the glow of the lanterns. The room shifted when she entered. Men stopped talking, cards froze mid-play. There was something about her that didn't belong here, something wounded, something proud. The rancher's gaze met hers. Recognition flickered, though he said nothing. She crossed the room and sat near the back, away from the crowd. When the barkeep brought her a drink, she barely touched it. Her eyes stayed fixed on the man at the bar, like she was weighing whether to speak or let silence do the work. "You've been gone a long time," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. He turned, glass in hand. "Long enough to learn the desert don't forgive." She looked down at her hands. "Nor forget." The silence that followed was heavy. Around them, the piano player struck a wrong note and muttered an apology. Someone laughed too loudly near the door, pretending not to watch. The rancher finished his drink and set it down, the glass clinking against the wood. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. She stood slowly and walked toward him, her boots barely making a sound on the dusty boards. When she stopped close, he could see the small cut on her lip and the faint bruise along her jaw. "What happened?" he asked low. "Same thing that always happens out here," she said, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Men take what they want. Others look away." The rancher's jaw tightened. His eyes dropped to the small leather pouch she clutched in her hand. It jingled faintly when she set it on the bar. "You've paid for me," she said, her voice trembling now. But her eyes stayed on his. "Just do it." The saloon went still again. Every whisper died. Even the piano player froze, his hand hovering over the keys. The rancher didn't move. For a long moment his face was unreadable, caught between shock and anger. Then he exhaled slowly and pushed the pouch back toward her. "I didn't come here for that," he said. Her hand trembled as she pulled the pouch back. "Then why are you here?" He looked toward the dark window, where the last light of day was fading behind the canyon rim. "Because someone needs to pay, but not you." A shadow crossed her face. "You think you can make it right after all this time?" "I can try," he said. "If you'll tell me who did that to you." Her lips parted, but before she could answer, the saloon doors banged open. A gust of cold wind swept in, scattering cards and smoke. 3 men stepped inside, dust-covered and armed. Their leader, tall, mean-eyed, with a scar running down his cheek, grinned when he saw her. "Well, look what we've got," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Didn't expect you to find a new friend so soon." The rancher didn't turn fully, but his hand drifted toward the holster on his hip. "Easy, cowboy," the scarred man warned, tapping the handle of his revolver. "This ain't your business." "She's under my protection," the rancher said quietly. The scarred man laughed, a dry, cruel sound. "Yours? You can't even protect your own land. Heard you lost everything last winter." The rancher's eyes narrowed. "I lost what I didn't need." The room seemed to shrink around them. The piano player stood and slipped toward the back. The barkeep ducked behind the counter. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. The woman's breath came fast now. Her eyes darted between the two men, knowing what was coming. "Please," she whispered. "Don't." The rancher's hand brushed the grip of his revolver, but he didn't draw. The scarred man's smirk widened. "Go on," he sneered. "You paid for her, didn't you? Then act like it." The rancher's gaze flicked toward the woman. Fear, defiance, and sorrow all tangled in her face. Something in him broke. In one swift motion, he turned, and the sound of the hammer cocking cut through the silence like thunder. But before anyone could move, the lantern by the door flickered, the flame sputtering out as a gust slammed through the open windows. Shadows swallowed the room. The woman gasped. The scarred man's grin faded, and then came the sound. Distant hooves. Thundering from the canyon road, growing closer, echoing through the night. The rancher froze, his finger resting on the trigger, his breath steady. The woman looked toward the door, eyes wide. "Who's that?" The scarred man barked, spinning around. No one answered. Outside, the hoofbeats stopped. Silence fell over the village again, heavier than before, like the desert itself was holding its breath. The rancher glanced once more at the woman. Her lips moved, barely a whisper. "They've come for both of us." And before he could ask what she meant, the door burst open, light flooding in, guns glinting in the firelight. The rancher acted decisively, but what happened next would haunt Silver Bend forever. Gunfire cracked through the saloon like a bolt of lightning splitting the night. Glass shattered, men dove for cover, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. The rancher dropped behind the bar, dragging the woman down with him as splinters rained from the counter. He drew his revolver, the metal cool and steady in his hand, and waited for the noise to break. When it did, he rose halfway, fired once. Clean, sharp, decisive. The first of the gunmen fell hard onto the floorboards, his hat rolling away into the corner. The scarred man cursed and fired back, the bullet grazing the lantern chain and sending sparks into the air. The rancher ducked again, his heart pounding steady but his breath measured. He could hear the woman beside him whispering, her words lost under the ringing in his ears. He turned to her. "Stay low. Don't move." She nodded, eyes wide but not hysterical. There was something in her face. Fear, yes, but also defiance. She wasn't a stranger to danger, that much he could tell. Outside, more hooves thundered past, the echo bouncing between the canyon walls. Whoever had ridden in was no small group. The rancher knew the sound of trouble. This was worse than he'd guessed. When the gunfire stopped, the saloon was thick with smoke and silence. The scarred man was gone, slipped out through the back door, leaving his dead partner on the floor. The rancher rose, checked the doorway, then holstered his gun. "He'll be back," he muttered. The barkeep, trembling behind the counter, peeked up. "What in God's name is happening?" The rancher didn't answer right away. His eyes followed the woman as she stood and brushed dust off her shawl. "Depends who those riders are," he finally said. "And who they're after." She turned toward the door, her shoulders tightening. "They're not after you," she said quietly. "They're after me." The words hung in the air. He studied her, really seeing her for the first time. Her clothes were simple but not poor, her boots good leather, her hands too fine for field work. There was a story behind those bruises, and he had the feeling it ran deeper than a saloon brawl or a jealous man. "Who are they?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing at the window as if the night itself might be listening. "Men who work for a man named Clayton. You'd remember him if you'd ever heard of him. Owns half the mines east of the river. Owns most of the sheriffs, too." The name stirred something faint in the rancher's memory. A deal gone wrong, a rumor about stolen land, men who vanished after crossing him. "What does he want with you?" She looked at him, her eyes hardening. "I saw something I shouldn't have. I thought I could leave, but he doesn't let anyone walk away." "Then why come here?" he asked. "Because this is where he won't look first," she said. "Silver Bend's too dead for a man like him." The rancher poured water into a tin cup from a nearby pitcher and handed it to her. She took it with a small nod, her hands still shaking. He stepped outside, scanning the dark street. The moon hung low over the rooftops, pale and cold. The only movement came from the shuttered windows and the distant flicker of torches moving through the canyon. The riders hadn't gone far. He turned back toward the saloon. "If you stay here, they'll find you by dawn. I don't have anywhere else to go," she said. Unless you do. He thought of his ranch, burned down, abandoned, lost to the bank. All that remained was an old line shack near the river, a day's ride from here. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, forgotten by most. "There's a place west of the ridge," he said finally. "You can rest there till I figure out what to do." She looked at him, searching his face. "And why would you help me?" He didn't answer right away. The truth was tangled. Maybe it was because of the way she looked when she said, "You've paid for me." Maybe it was because he knew what it was like to lose everything. Or maybe he just couldn't walk away again. Not this time. "Because I've seen enough men like Clayton ruin good people," he said. "And because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it." The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right. By dawn, they were gone. The desert stretched endless around them, a sea of sand and sun-bleached rock. They rode in silence most of the morning, the sound of hooves and wind their only company. She rode steady, though the dust caught in her hair and stung her eyes. The rancher kept glancing back, watching for movement behind the dunes. He knew Clayton's kind, rich men with long arms and short tempers. They wouldn't stop at the county line. Around midday, they stopped by a dried-up creek bed. The woman slid off her horse, her legs trembling from the long ride. The rancher untied a canteen and passed it to her. She drank slowly, then looked around the barren land. "Hard to believe people ever settled here." He gave a small laugh. "They didn't come for comfort. They came for chance, same as me." "You were a rancher once," she said softly. "Still am," he replied, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "Had cattle, land, a barn full of hay. Thought that'd be enough. What happened?" He stared out at the horizon. "Fire. Started one night while I was out rounding up strays. By the time I got back, there wasn't much left. Lost my wife that night, too. Some said it was an accident. Others didn't." Her eyes softened. "You think it wasn't?" "I think accidents don't usually come with footprints leading away." The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of sage. She said nothing more, and neither did he. When the sun began to dip again, they reached the ridge. Beyond it, the land opened into a narrow valley where cottonwoods grew along a trickle of river. At the far end stood the shack, lean, crooked, but standing. Smoke stains marked the roof, and a rusty lantern hung by the door. "It's not much," he said. "It's enough," she replied. Inside, the air smelled of old timber and dust. He lit a small fire while she unpacked what little they had. For a moment, the flicker of light softened the edges of their exhaustion. "You still haven't told me your name," he said. She smiled faintly. "Names are dangerous where I come from." He nodded, respecting that. "Then I'll call you whatever you let me." After a pause, she said, "Call me Clara." The name felt strange in the small room, like it didn't belong to her yet. But it fit somehow. That night, the wind howled through the canyon like a warning. The rancher sat awake by the dying fire, listening. He could hear the river's faint murmur and the restless shifting of the horses outside. Clara slept fitfully, muttering in her dreams. At one point, she whispered something. One word he couldn't quite catch, but it sounded like mine. He stared into the embers, unease creeping through him. He had the feeling she hadn't told him everything. By morning, his suspicion deepened. Her story didn't quite line up. How she said she'd seen something, how she'd escaped. There were details missing, things she avoided when he asked. Still, when she smiled, he wanted to believe her. They spent the day patching the roof, fetching water, and keeping low. Every so often, the rancher would step outside, scanning the horizon. He saw nothing but dust and the glint of sun off the rocks. Yet that uneasy feeling lingered, the kind that told him danger wasn't gone, only waiting. Late that afternoon, as the sun turned red and low, he heard it again, the sound of hooves. Slow at first, then steady. Clara froze. "They found us," she whispered. The rancher grabbed his rifle and stepped outside. 3 riders were coming down the trail, their silhouettes black against the glare. One carried a flag of white cloth tied to his saddle. "They're not coming to parley," he muttered. Clara's face paled. "That one in front, it's Clayton's man." The riders stopped about 50 yards out. The lead man raised his hand and called out, "We're not here to fight!" The lady owes a debt, that's all. Hand her over and we'll be gone before nightfall. The rancher's grip tightened around the rifle. Debt? He shouted back. The man laughed. She didn't tell you? She's no innocent. She took something from Mr. Clayton, something valuable. The rancher glanced at Clara. She said nothing, but her eyes gave her away. Fear mixed with something else. Guilt. What did you take? He asked quietly. She swallowed hard. Proof, papers, contracts he forged, land he stole. Enough to ruin him if anyone ever saw them. And where are they now? She met his eyes, tears glinting in the firelight. Hidden, but he thinks I still have them. The rancher turned back to the men outside. You'll get nothing from me, the leader smirked. Then you'll both hang for it. He turned his horse, signaling the others. They rode off slowly, dust rising behind them. Clara sank to her knees, her voice trembling. He'll send more. He always does. The rancher looked toward the horizon, where the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Then we'll be ready. But as night fell, he couldn't shake the thought that maybe he didn't know who he was protecting, or why she'd really come to Silver Bend at all. And somewhere, in the dark beyond the ridge, a lantern flickered twice, the signal of men drawing near again. The night settled over the valley, heavy and still, the kind of silence that pressed against the skin and made every creak of wood sound like a warning. The rancher sat outside the shack with his rifle across his lap, staring into the distance where the last trace of light had faded behind the hills. The wind had died, leaving the smell of dust and sage hanging thick in the air. Somewhere out there, he knew Clayton's men were waiting, watching, maybe even counting the hours till dawn. Inside, Clara paced the floor, her steps soft against the boards. She stopped now and then, peering out the window toward the dark ridge. Her face was pale, drawn, but her eyes burned with something more than fear. It was determination, or maybe guilt wearing its mask. She caught the rancher's reflection through the glass and spoke quietly. You think they'll come tonight? He didn't turn. If they do, we'll hear them long before they reach us. But I'd bet they'll wait till daylight. Easier to track a man when you can see the dust he stirs. She nodded, hugging her shawl close. Clayton doesn't like to wait. He'll send more men, ones who won't stop till it's done. The rancher finally looked at her. Then you better tell me everything before that happens. She hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of the shawl. You wouldn't believe me if I did. Try me. For a long time she said nothing. The only sound was the faint crackle of the dying fire. Then she sighed and sat near the hearth. Clayton's not just stealing land. He's been bribing surveyors, forging deeds, pushing families off their ranches with fake claims. Some of those people have been there for generations. He's taken mines, too, ones that were never his to begin with. I was part of his household, not by choice, not the way folks might think. I worked there. I kept the books. And one day I saw what he'd been doing. The rancher's jaw tightened. And you took the proof. She nodded slowly. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I only meant to bring it to the sheriff. But before I could, someone tipped him off. I barely got out. He stared into the fire, the glow catching the edge of his weathered face. You said the papers were hidden. They're safe, she said, though the way her voice trembled made it sound less certain. But if he catches me, he'll burn every scrap of it and everyone who ever tried to stop him. The rancher leaned back, the old chair creaking beneath him. And you think I can stop him? I think you're the only one out here who still might care enough to try. He didn't answer. He just looked out the door again, at the stretch of darkness that seemed endless. For a man who had already lost everything, there wasn't much left to risk, except his own life. By morning, the decision was made without words. They packed what they could, watered the horses, and prepared to ride deeper west. But as they saddled up, the rancher noticed something strange. Hoof prints, fresh ones, leading down from the north ridge. He crouched to study them, his hand brushing the cool dust. They found the trail, Clara's face drained of color. Then we have to move now. They rode hard through the day, keeping to the low ground where the mesquite and cactus offered thin cover. The sun beat down mercilessly, and by noon, heat shimmered off the rocks like ghostly smoke. The rancher led the way, his eyes scanning every ridge, every dry gulch where a man might hide. Clara followed close behind, silent, focused. By the time the sky turned gold again, they reached the edge of an old mining settlement, nothing more than a scatter of shacks and a collapsed shaft that once promised silver. The place had been abandoned for years, but it was shelter enough for the night. They took cover in one of the sturdier buildings, the roof half caved but still holding. The rancher built a small fire in the corner while Clara rested against a wall, exhaustion written across her face. He broke the silence. You said you worked for him. There must have been others who saw what you saw. There were, she said quietly. 2 men and a woman who helped me gather the papers. One of them, Jonas, was supposed to meet me near Red Creek with a wagon. He never showed. I heard later they found a body floating in the river. I didn't go back to check. The rancher looked into the flames, his mind turning over the pieces. Clayton wasn't just greedy, he was careful. Men like that didn't leave loose ends unless they meant to tie them off later. After a while, Clara spoke again. You said your wife died in that fire. Do you think Clayton had anything to do with it? The question hit harder than he expected. He hadn't spoken his wife's name aloud in years. Maybe, he said finally. Back then I was fighting to keep the land. Clayton sent men to buy me out. When I refused, strange things started happening. Missing cattle, broken fences, threats. Then one night the fire. I never proved it, but I always figured it was him or someone paid by him. Clara looked down. Then we're both running from the same devil. He gave a slow nod. Difference is, I stopped running a long time ago. Before she could answer, a sound cut through the still air. A horse's snort, followed by the crunch of footsteps outside. Both froze. The rancher put out the fire with his boot, plunging the shack into darkness. He motioned for her to stay quiet and moved to the door. Voices murmured outside. 2 men close. Tracks end here, one said. You sure they came this way? Positive. Boss wants the girl alive, the man, not so much. The rancher's grip tightened on his revolver. He waited till their shadows passed across the doorway, then whispered to Clara. Out the back. Go now. She slipped through the hole in the rear wall, crawling into the scrub. The rancher waited another second before stepping out, gun raised. Looking for someone? He called. The men spun, startled, reaching for their weapons, but not fast enough. The rancher fired once, hitting the lantern one of them carried. It exploded, flames licking up the man's coat. The other dropped to the ground, rolling behind a water trough. The fight was brief, brutal, and over almost as soon as it began. When the dust settled, one man lay still. The other had fled into the hills. The rancher didn't chase. He knew there'd be more coming. He found Clara crouched behind a boulder, clutching a small leather satchel. They'll bring a dozen next time, he said. I know, she whispered. That's why we can't keep running. We need to get the papers to someone who can use them. Sheriff? She shook her head. Not him. Clayton owns him. But there's a preacher in San Verne. He used to be a lawyer. If anyone can make this right, it's him. San Verne was 2 days' ride through open desert. No cover, no water for miles. The rancher thought about it, weighing the risk. If we go that way, we'll be exposed the whole time. She looked at him, her voice firm. It's the only way. They set out again at dawn. The air was cool, the ground still holding the chill of night. Clara rode ahead for once, her posture straight, her resolve clear. The rancher followed close, scanning the ridges. By midday, the sun was high and merciless. They stopped beneath a lone mesquite tree for shade. As the horses drank from a small canteen, the rancher asked, What's in that satchel? Clara hesitated, then opened it slightly. Inside were folded papers, bound with a faded ribbon. He caught a glimpse of signatures, seals, maps. Evidence, just like she'd said. But there was something else, a photograph, old and worn. The rancher frowned. Who's that? She hesitated before answering. Clayton. And the woman beside him. Your wife. The word struck him like a gunshot. He took the photo, studying the faded image. It was her face, smiling, alive, standing beside the man who'd destroyed everything he had. Clara spoke softly. I didn't know how to tell you. I found that photo among the papers. I think she was forced to work with him after the fire. Maybe she didn't die that night. Maybe she was taken. The desert seemed to tilt beneath him. For years he'd carried that grief like a weight he couldn't set down. And now, the ground shifted beneath everything he believed. He looked up at her. You're sure? I wish I wasn't, she said. A long silence followed, broken only by the wind. Then he folded the photo, tucked it into his coat, and said quietly, Then I've got more reason than ever to finish this. As the sun bled red over the horizon, they rode on toward San Verne, neither speaking again. But in the distance, faint and rising, came the echo of hooves, many this time closing fast. The rancher reached for his rifle, eyes fixed on the trail behind them. Clara tightened her hold on the reins. Night was coming fast, and with it, the men who carried Clayton's orders. They didn't stop riding. The sound of pursuit grew louder, echoing through the valley, until the line between hunter and hunted blurred in the dying light. And as darkness swallowed the desert once more, the truth, whatever it was, rode with them, waiting to be revealed when the sun rose again. The desert night stretched wide and cold, the stars flickering like distant campfires above the endless plain. Clara and the rancher rode in silence, the sound of their horses' hooves muffled by the sand. Behind them, the horizon pulsed with faint lights, riders carrying torches, the unmistakable glow of pursuit. Each mile they gained felt borrowed, temporary. The desert had a way of taking back its debts. The rancher's thoughts ran as hard as the horses. The photo burned in his pocket, heavier than iron. His wife's face beside Clayton's. It didn't fit with the story he'd told himself for years. The fire, the grief, the endless bitterness. He'd buried her memory under layers of dust and silence, but now it stirred again, raw and dangerous. Clara had said maybe she'd been taken, maybe she'd lived. But if that was true, why hadn't she come back? He shook the thought away. The past would have to wait. For now, survival was all that mattered. The moonlight glimmered off the sand, silver and cold. They had been riding since sunset with no rest, chasing the faint hope of reaching San Verne by dawn. Clara's shoulders slumped with fatigue, but she didn't complain. Every so often she looked back, scanning the distance. The torchlight seemed closer each time. "Keep steady," the rancher said, voice low but firm. "They'll tire before we do." She gave a small nod, but her hands trembled on the reins. "If they catch us before San Verne, they won't," he interrupted. But even he didn't believe it. Hours passed. The air grew colder, sharper. A thin mist began to crawl up from the river flats. By the time the first faint blush of dawn touched the far hills, both horses were lathered and stumbling. They found a shallow ravine and rode down into it, taking cover beneath a rocky overhang. The rancher slid from his saddle, scanning the horizon. No torches now, only the slow gray light of morning. "We'll rest here for an hour," he said. "They'll be tracking, but they'll lose the trail in the mist." Clara dismounted, her legs buckling slightly as she hit the ground. He caught her by the arm before she fell. "Easy," he murmured. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was ragged. "Just tired." She sat against a boulder while he tended the horses. When he finally joined her, she was holding the satchel close, her fingers tracing its worn edges like it was something sacred. "Those papers," he said quietly. "They're enough to ruin him, you're sure?" "They show every false claim, every stolen acre," she said. "If we can get them to the preacher in San Verne, he can send copies east. Once it's in the papers, Clayton can't hide anymore." The rancher nodded. "Then that's where we'll end this." Clara looked at him, her expression softening. "You don't have to do this for me." "I'm not," he said. "I'm doing it for everyone he's buried under his greed, and maybe for someone I lost." The wind shifted then, soft at first, then sharper. The horses lifted their heads uneasy. The rancher tensed, hand dropping to his revolver. From above the ridge came the faint crunch of boots on gravel. Clara's eyes widened. "They found us." He gestured for silence, easing forward to the edge of the ravine. Shadows moved along the rim, 3 riders this time, scanning the ground below. He could make out their rifles catching the morning light. He motioned to Clara. "Stay here." Before she could protest, he crept toward the slope, keeping low. The air was so still he could hear their voices. "Trail ends down there," one said. "They're close. Boss says take her alive. Don't matter what happens to the man." The rancher steadied his breath, pulled his rifle into position, and took aim. The first shot cracked through the stillness, sending a rider tumbling backward. The other 2 scrambled for cover, shouting. Clara ducked behind a rock, clutching the satchel. Bullets chipped stone near his head as he fired again. One man fell, the other fled, spurring his horse hard down the ridge. The rancher fired once more, the shot grazing the man's shoulder but not stopping him. Silence settled again, broken only by the horse's frightened snorts. Clara crawled toward him. "They'll bring more." He wiped the sweat from his brow. "Then we better move before they do." They rode again, faster now, the urgency in every stride. The landscape changed as they neared San Verne, the sand giving way to dry grass and scattered mesquite trees. Smoke curled faintly in the distance, the promise of the town. But promises in the desert were never easy. By mid-morning, the sky had turned a blinding white, and a line of riders appeared behind them. 5, maybe 6. Clara saw them first. "They're gaining!" The rancher turned in the saddle, firing once. The shot forced them to slow but not stop. "Keep going!" he shouted. They pushed the horses harder, the town still a faint shimmer ahead, the church steeple barely visible through the heat haze. Every muscle in his body ached, but he didn't let go. Not now. As they neared a narrow pass between two rocky bluffs, Clara gasped. "They're cutting us off!" 3 riders had circled ahead, blocking the trail. Clayton's men were everywhere. The rancher yanked the reins, pulling off toward the left where a dried gully ran between the rocks. They plunged into it, hooves kicking up dust. Shots rang out, echoing through the canyon walls. One bullet tore through his coat sleeve. Another grazed the horse's flank. Clara clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white. "We can't outrun them." "We don't have to," he said. "Just lose them." He veered toward a break in the rocks where the gully split in 2. "Take the other path," he called. "Head straight for town. Don't stop." "What about you?" she shouted back. "I'll draw them off." Before she could argue, he fired another shot toward the pursuers and turned down the right fork, kicking his horse hard. The sound of pursuit split behind them, some following him, others chasing her. He rode through the narrow canyon, every turn a blur of rock and dust. Gunfire cracked behind him, bullets ricocheting off stone. His horse stumbled once but kept running. When he reached a small clearing, he reined in and turned, waiting. 3 riders burst through the pass. The rancher steadied his rifle. The first man fell instantly. The second fired wild and missed. The third hesitated, then turned to retreat. But the rancher's shot found him before he could disappear. The silence that followed was deafening. He waited, breath ragged, then wheeled his horse around and raced back toward the main trail. He rode hard until the canyon opened again. Far in the distance, through the shimmering air, he could see the outline of San Verne, a few low buildings, a church steeple, smoke rising from chimneys. But nearer to the right he spotted movement. 2 riders closing fast, chasing Clara. He pushed his horse to full gallop. The world narrowed to dust, sun, and the thunder of hooves. When he finally reached the open flat he could see her, her horse slowing, the men closing in. "Clara!" he shouted, raising his rifle. She turned, startled, and ducked as he fired. The shot hit one of the riders square in the chest. The other swung his revolver, firing back. The rancher's horse stumbled, throwing him hard into the dirt. The breath was knocked from him, the world spinning. He forced himself up, pain flaring through his ribs. The second rider bore down, revolver drawn. The rancher reached for his gun, but it had fallen just out of reach. Dust swirled around him, blinding. The rider raised his weapon, then a shot cracked from somewhere behind. The man jerked, falling from his saddle. Clara sat astride her horse, smoking revolver in hand, face pale but steady. The rancher staggered to his feet. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, lowering the gun. "You shouldn't have turned back." "I wasn't about to let you face them alone." They stood for a moment, catching their breath. The sun burned overhead, and San Verne waited just beyond the next ridge. "Come on," he said. "Let's finish this." They reached the edge of town by afternoon. The streets were quiet, the heat shimmering off the dirt road. A few townsfolk watched from behind shuttered windows as they rode in, their clothes torn, faces streaked with dust. The preacher's small church stood at the far end, its door open. Clara slid from her horse, clutching the satchel. "He's inside," she said. "He'll know what to do." The rancher followed her to the steps, but before they could enter, the sound of hooves rose again behind them. Dozens this time. They turned to see a column of riders coming down the road, the man at the front unmistakable even from afar. Clayton. He rode tall and sure, dressed in a dark coat despite the heat, his face calm and cold as stone. Behind him, his men fanned out, rifles ready. Clara's breath caught. "He's here." The rancher's hand went to his gun. "Then it ends here too." Clayton reined in, stopping 10 paces away. His voice carried easily across the dusty street. "You've given me quite the chase," he said. "But I always finish what I start." Clara stepped forward. "You stole everything from those people. You killed for it. But it's over, Clayton." He smiled faintly. "You think those papers will matter? I own this town, girl. That preacher won't even open his mouth unless I tell him to." The rancher raised his weapon. "Then maybe he'll listen to the sound of a gun." Clayton's men drew theirs in answer. The street filled with the tense rattle of metal and breath. Clara clutched the satchel to her chest, whispering, "This is it." The rancher's eyes locked on Clayton's. The air went still. Too still, like the whole desert was holding its breath again. Then, from behind the church came the faint sound of footsteps. The preacher appeared in the doorway, pale, holding something in his hand. Everyone turned. The next moment, Everything broke loose, gunfire exploded through the street, and the climax began to take shape in the blinding chaos of smoke, dust, and vengeance long overdue. Gunfire echoed through the main street of San Verne, kicking up a storm of dust and screams. Horses reared, bullets struck wood and stone, and the sharp smell of gunpowder filled the air. The rancher dove behind a trough, reloading as splinters flew past his head. Clayton's men had fanned out across the road, shouting orders, trying to pin him and Clara down. The preacher had vanished inside the church, the door slamming shut behind him. Clara crouched beside a wagon wheel, clutching the satchel to her chest. "They're everywhere," she shouted. "Stay low." The rancher yelled back. He popped up, fired twice, and ducked again as return shots hit the wagon. One of the bullets grazed his shoulder, burning hot, but he didn't stop. The only thought that kept him moving was that this fight had been waiting for years, long before he even met Clara. The church bell suddenly rang out above the chaos. A sharp, piercing clang that made everyone freeze for a heartbeat. The door burst open again, and the preacher stepped out holding a bundle of papers high. "These records belong to the people of this land," he cried, "and they'll see daylight today." Clayton turned toward him, fury flashing in his eyes. "Shoot him!" he shouted. But before his men could react, Clara darted from her cover, sprinting toward the church steps. The rancher saw it happen like a slow dream. She stumbled once but kept going, waving the satchel. "You want them?" she shouted at Clayton. "Then come and take them yourself." Clayton spurred his horse forward, his revolver gleaming. "Clara!" the rancher shouted, rising from cover. He fired, hitting one of the gunmen beside Clayton, then another. Dust swirled around him as chaos broke loose again. He could barely see through the haze, but he caught a glimpse of Clara and Clayton near the steps, struggling over the satchel. The preacher tried to pull Clara back, but Clayton shoved him aside. His gun went off, the sound deafening, echoing off the church walls. The rancher ran toward them, firing as he moved. Clayton turned at the sound, raising his revolver, but it was too late. The rancher's bullet hit him square in the chest. He staggered, eyes wide, and fell backward down the steps, landing hard in the dust. The street went quiet except for the crackle of distant flames and the groans of wounded men. The fight was over. Clara stood trembling at the top of the steps, dust covering her dress, the satchel clutched tight. The preacher knelt beside Clayton's body, murmuring something under his breath. The rancher holstered his weapon and walked toward her slowly, each step heavy. "You all right?" he asked softly. She nodded weakly, her voice barely a whisper. "It's done." He looked down at Clayton, the man who'd stolen so much. Land, lives, peace. The man who'd nearly destroyed everything again. "Yeah," the rancher said quietly. "It's done." By the time the sheriff and townsfolk came out from hiding, the sun had risen high, baking the street in harsh light. The preacher handed over the satchel and papers, and soon word spread through San Verne like fire in dry grass. People gathered, reading names and deeds and signatures, proof of what Clayton had taken from them all. Within hours, the whole town seemed to exhale for the first time in years. Men shook hands, women wept, and the air carried a strange mix of relief and disbelief. It was as if a shadow that had hung over them forever had finally lifted. The rancher sat on the steps of the church, wrapping a strip of cloth around his shoulder. Clara sat beside him, quiet, her hands folded in her lap. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe. "I didn't think we'd make it," she said softly. He gave a faint smile. "Neither did I. Guess we both got lucky." She looked at him then, really looked, and there was something different in her eyes. Not fear, not relief. Something steadier, something like peace. "What'll you do now?" she asked. He looked out at the horizon where the desert shimmered beyond the hills. "Haven't thought that far ahead. Maybe head back east. Maybe start again somewhere nobody knows my name." "You could stay," she said after a moment. "The people here could use someone who isn't afraid to stand up to men like him." He thought about it. The quiet of the plains, the work of rebuilding, the chance to belong somewhere again. "Maybe," he said, "but you got your life ahead of you now. You should go live it," she smiled faintly. "Maybe I'll try." For a long while they sat in silence, watching the townsfolk gather the wounded and tend to the fallen. The preacher spoke quietly with the sheriff, pointing toward the courthouse. There'd be questions, trials, reckonings, but at least now there was proof. Truth had a way of surviving even in the desert. By evening, the town had begun to settle. The church bell rang once more, not a warning this time, but something gentler, almost hopeful. Children ran through the street again. Someone started a fire for cooking. For the first time in years, San Vern felt alive. The rancher helped Clara to her feet. "You ought to get some rest," he said. "I will," she replied. "You should too." He nodded but didn't move right away. His gaze lingered on the horizon where the sky was turning gold and red. "Funny thing about this land," he said quietly. "It takes a lot from you, but sometimes it gives something back when you least expect it." She looked at him, understanding in her eyes. "It gave me you," she said softly. He didn't answer right away, just gave a tired smile. "Guess it did." When the night came, it brought a calm wind that carried the smell of sage and smoke. The preacher lit a lantern inside the church, and the faint glow spilled through the windows, warm against the dark. The rancher walked alone through the quiet street, his boots stirring dust. The sound of laughter drifted from a nearby porch. Somewhere, a fiddle played a slow tune, an old one, the kind that carried both joy and sorrow in the same breath. He stopped near the edge of town, looking out over the desert. It stretched endless and silent, just as it always had. But it didn't seem so cruel now. Maybe because, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't carrying the same weight. Behind him, Clara appeared in the doorway of the inn, her hair loose in the lamplight. "You leaving?" she asked. He hesitated, thinking about it. "There's a lot of open road out there. There's a lot of work here too," she said. "And people who'll remember what you did." He met her eyes across the distance. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he gave a slow nod. "Maybe I'll stick around a while." She smiled, small and knowing. "Good." He turned back toward the desert once more, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. The stars were coming out, bright and countless like they'd been the night they first met. The world felt bigger now, but also clearer. Maybe, he thought, some wounds weren't meant to disappear. Maybe they were meant to remind you what it took to survive. When he finally walked back toward the light, the sound of the fiddle grew louder, the laughter warmer. San Vern had begun to heal, and so had he. The preacher was right when he'd said the truth always finds a way through. The papers would spread. Clayton's empire would crumble, his name remembered only as a warning. The land would return to those who'd earned it, who worked it with their hands and hearts instead of greed. As the rancher stepped into the glow of the lamplight again, Clara met him halfway. They didn't need to speak. Some stories didn't end with words. They ended with the quiet peace of knowing something had finally been set right. Above them, the stars burned steady, watching over a town that had almost forgotten what hope felt like. The desert wind moved softly through the empty street, whispering through the old signs and wooden beams, carrying the last echoes of gunfire away into the night. And when morning came, San Vern would wake to a new day, its people unbroken, its land free, and the rancher, for the first time in years, at peace with both his past and the wide, endless horizon that awaited him.